About 8 years ago now, the eyes of the world were transfixed on a near tragedy that was happening in the South American country of Chile. You probably remember this. 33 Chilean miners were trapped in a mine 2,000 feet below the surface for 68 days. They were completely cut off, living in the dark, with almost no food and even less hope. One newspaper in Santiago estimated their odds of survival to be 2%. And now, faced with almost certain death, many of the miners began to reflect on their lives and the regrets that they had. We now know that deep inside the mine, they got on their knees and prayed. Not so much for their rescue, because they really didn't have much hope of that. They prayed and they confessed their sins. They confessed their failures as husbands and fathers, and they confessed their addictions and their character flaws. They even started to confess to each other the sins they had committed since the accident in the mine. They apologized to each other for being angry and for not helping each other enough. And their suffering bonded them together into this amazing community until their rescue came. A drill finally cut through the rock and got through to them, and they were given food and water and other supplies, and they knew they were going to be rescued. And then they learned that they were becoming famous all over the world. And that maybe, just maybe, this terrible experience might actually end up making them all rich. And at that point, something happened. They stopped confessing, and they stopped praying. In many ways, things were getting a lot better for them, and yet in other ways, it was getting worse. Commenting on this reality many years later, someone said of them this: they were at their best when life was at its worst. We've all witnessed this in our own lives, I think. Sometimes what connects us most strongly with God and with each other is mutual shared suffering. Suffering has the power to create community like almost nothing else. In fact, many of us have witnessed this in just the last few months as we've watched Christine Moritz decline and pass away this last week from cancer. I think most of you know we've been praying for Christine and her family here at St. Paul's for a long time now. For those of you who don't know her, Christine is the wife of Todd Moritz, who is the executive director at Orange Lutheran High School. And what was amazing to watch was the incredible community that formed around the Moritz family during this terrible time of suffering and struggle. People visited them and encouraged them and did things for them. And even beyond that, this huge online community formed around them through Christine's blog, where she shared her story and her suffering and her incredible faith in Jesus. Again, we saw that suffering has the capacity to bring people together like almost nothing else can. But we also learned this morning that this is not automatic. Sometimes, like with Christine or the Chilean miners, suffering forms community, but other times, just the opposite happens. Suffering can also just as easily bring isolation. This is what we see happening in our scripture reading for today from John 4. This Samaritan woman that Jesus encounters was suffering, and suffering alone. It says that she had had 5 husbands, and that she was now living with a 6th man who was not her husband. And we have to be careful not to read this story through our 21st century glasses. Understand, she was not doing this because she was some sexually liberated, self-centered woman. In fact, she was probably not doing anything. Women in the ancient world were not allowed to sue for divorce. This was being done to her, not by her. And whatever her current living arrangement was exactly, it wasn't like she was having some romantic affair. It was probably more like she had become a sort of sex slave for her own survival because she truly had nowhere else to go. This Samaritan woman was suffering. But notice in this story, no community of support formed around her. Her suffering brought isolation, not connection. And we see this in what seems at first to be a rather innocuous detail. John says she came to the well about the 6th hour. Now, this is how Jews track time in the ancient world. The day for them would start around 6 a.m. That would be the 1st hour. And so the 6th hour would be 6 hours after that, or around 12 noon. It was lunchtime. Now, for us modern people, this means nothing because, of course, we get our water anytime we want, day or night, straight out of the faucet. But this was, of course, not the way it worked in the ancient world of Jesus. Let me show you another Bible verse from the story of Abraham. And this verse, understand, has nothing to do with our story except for one very helpful detail. Genesis 24:11 says this: He had the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time the women go out to draw water. In other words, 12 noon is not the normal time you go to the well for water, because, of course, in a desert climate like Palestine, it's incredibly hot at 12 noon. You go get your water in the evening when it's much cooler and more tolerable. And notice also it says women, plural. In other words, you don't go get your water alone. All the women of the community go to the well together in the evening so they can talk and laugh and share their day and socialize a little. But notice this woman wasn't included in that. Her suffering had made her an outcast until Jesus showed up. And Jesus, we see, broke the norms and conventions of the day and reached out to this woman in her suffering when no one else would. And in so doing, he models for us how he wants us to act in times of suffering. He wants suffering to bring about connection, not isolation. And yet, there is so much more happening here than even that. You see, one of the problems we have with this story is that we think we've read it from the beginning. But the truth is, we're actually entering into this story way, way down the line. It's kind of like this. How many of you maybe recognize this picture? Anyone recognize this? This is a scene from the recent movie Solo, which is the latest in the Star Wars franchise. For those of you who don't know, the man on the right is a young Han Solo, and he's here flying his spaceship, the Millennium Falcon, and notice he has a big smile on his face. There's this wonderful point in this movie where he's about to do something, and he says this great line. He says this: "I have a really good feeling about this." Now, if this is the only Star Wars movie that you've ever seen, this line would mean absolutely nothing to you. But if you've watched all of the other Star Wars movies, like I have, you would know that this line is intended to be ironically humorous. Because in all of the other Star Wars movies, one of the famous reoccurring lines is what, Star Wars fans? I have a really bad feeling about this. In fact, let's take a look.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I don't sense anything.
I've got a bad feeling about this. Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
I've got a bad feeling about...
Hey.
Quiet.
What?
Very bad feeling about this.
I got a bad feeling about this.
There's an awful lot of moisture in here.
I don't know. I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a really bad feeling about this.
I got a bad feeling about this.
So you see what I mean, right? You won't get the joke in the news story unless you're familiar with all of the older stories. And you see the same kind of thing is happening here with this story. Any first century Jew who was reading this story from John 4 would realize something that none of us do. And that's that this story has happened before in the Bible. In fact, it's happened many times before. It happened in Genesis 24. In Genesis 24, Abraham is looking for a wife for his son Isaac. And so he sends his servant out to a foreign country, and he sits down by a well. And a beautiful virgin woman named Rebecca shows up to get water from the well. And the servant asks her for a drink, and she gives it to him. And then they have some conversation, and the woman runs home to tell her family about it. And when they hear the news, her father says, well, bring the man home. And then the servant and the father talk a little more, and at the end of the story, Isaac gets a wife. But see, this is not the only time this happens. It happens again in Genesis 29, this time with Jacob. Jacob is in a foreign land this time, and he sits down by a well. And he needs a drink, this time for the sheep that he's shepherding, and he gets the drink. And once again, a beautiful virgin woman shows up, Rachel, and he is smitten by her, and they have a little conversation. And then, once again, the girl runs home and tells her father, and her father says, well, bring him home. And he does, she does, and the father and Jacob have some conversation, and Jacob ends up with Rachel as his wife. This same thing happens again in Exodus 2. This time it's Moses who's in a foreign land. He flees to Midian after he kills an Egyptian. And when he gets there, guess what he does? He finds a well, and he sits down by it. And once again, a beautiful virgin woman named Zipporah shows up. And once again, watering happens. And once again, she goes home to her father. And once again, he says, we'll bring him home. And the father and Moses have some conversation. And at the end of it all, he gives Zipporah to Moses to be his wife. This same story keeps happening over and over again in Jewish history. Now, some of the details change each time, but this basic story keeps repeating itself over and over. A Jewish man goes to a foreign land. He sits down by a well. A beautiful virgin woman just happens to come by. He asks her for water, and she gives it to him. They have some conversation. Then the woman runs home and tells her father, and the father says, hey, go back and bring him home. And then the father and the man talk a little more, and the man ends up with a wife. See, this is the story that is happening in John 4. Once again, a Jewish man, Jesus, is in a foreign land, Samaria. Once again, he sits down by a well when a woman comes by, and they have some conversation. But notice, this time, some of the details are very different. I mean, first, as we noted before, the timing of this encounter is all wrong. This story should not happen at 12 noon. And this time, the woman is not a beautiful virgin. In fact, this woman is no man's dream wife. And notice this time, Jesus asks for a drink. But look carefully, he never gets it. And the woman does run home and tell everyone about it, but perhaps most noticeable of all, this time the Jewish guy in the story doesn't get married. Any ancient Jewish reader would have looked at this and said, hey, wait a minute, you're messing up the story. Jesus is supposed to get a wife at the end. But John just moves on to other things. And he just leaves all of this hanging until he gets to the very end of his account of the Jesus story. Several chapters later, Jesus appears before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate condemns him to death by crucifixion. And right at that precise moment in the narrative, John adds this little detail. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. And then a few verses later, he records another very important detail that none of the other gospel writers mention. Jesus asks for a drink, and he gets it. Later, knowing that all was now completed, and so that the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on the stalk of a hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. And when he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus finally gets his drink. And in so doing, he also finally gets his bride. As John would write later in Revelation, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. Do you see what that's saying? John wants us to understand that Jesus' bride is all of us. We are the bride of Christ, but we were not chosen like Rebecca or Rachel or Zipporah were. We weren't chosen by Jesus because we were so beautiful and so perfect. No, we were like the Samaritan woman, chosen by Jesus to be his bride when we were absolutely unlovable. John is trying to tell us that Jesus Christ meets us in our suffering. And he connects with us through his own suffering. And this is why we connect with others in their suffering. Because when we do, then it can be said of us also, they were at their best when life was at its worst. Let's bow our heads and pray.